We fear losing money as if it were a catastrophe, a personal failure, a mark of incompetence, or even a threat to our identity. But what if financial loss is not something to fear? Wisdom that's thousands of years old gives us a counterintuitive truth. Losing wealth doesn't diminish us, it can free us. In a world obsessed with material success, perhaps the true liberation lies in learning how to embrace rather than fear financial setbacks. I'm going to identify 3 principles that can guide us in considering loss. We'll start with a couple of practical points on a different perspective towards loss. Then we might take a look at some more radical spiritual perspectives based on ancient wisdom. So what does economics tell us about loss? Standard economic theory views losses as negative outcomes that rational actors will try to avoid. There's no ambiguity in this. Economics tells us that losses are bad, to be feared. So much of our politics, our society, our way of living is influenced by this standard economic view. But what if it's not true? And what if people from thousands of years ago were already saying this? At first glance, it might seem counterintuitive to suggest that something good can come from loss. After all, modern capitalism inherently equates success with wealth and the loss of wealth with failure. We don't have to get all spiritual to have a different perspective on loss. Let's start in a really practical way. A 2015 Forbes article highlighted a poll in which 61% of investors in Broadway theatre productions admitted that they hadn't made a profit, yet 85% of them said they'd enjoyed the experience and would invest again. Their motivation wasn't solely financial. It was about being part of something bigger than themselves, contributing to the cultural landscape and nurturing creativity. Here the investment wasn't measured strictly in monetary terms, but by a deeper, more meaningful outcome. So here's our first principle, I think, that loss might be worth it if there are benefits that result from it. I think that this is actually the way we should be viewing taxes. Yes, taxes can be viewed as a personal loss, the government's taking money from me, but being part of a community, something larger than yourself, valuing collective societal benefits as a counterbalance to personal loss. For these theatre investors, losing money wasn't a defeat, it was an opportunity to engage in something fulfilling and significant. A recent article in the FT titled "How to Stay Happy When You've Lost a Fortune" was actually the prompt for me making this video. It highlights the case of John Foley, the co-founder of Peloton. Foley told the FT that due to the financial turbulence experienced by the company, he'd lost all his money and he had to sell almost everything in his life. But despite this dramatic reversal of fortune, the article notes that Foley's attitude was really striking, that he exhibited a calm acceptance of his losses, and that he maintained a sense of purpose and identity. While he didn't lose everything, he still holds a stake in Peloton, by the way, so clearly he's far from destitute. His approach offers a stark contrast to the widespread fear of financial failure. Foley is perhaps typical of the tech Silicon Valley business culture, whereas many entrepreneurs and investors may have been traditionally conservative and viewed loss as a failure. There is perhaps a new business culture of taking more risks, of greater mental resilience. We might call this the Thomas Edison business philosophy. I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. So the principle is to view loss not as a negative, not as an indication of personal capability, not as indicating that the person is a loser, but rather as a step towards success. There's a third way of looking at loss, and here I am going to get a bit more radical. Foley's resilience mirrors teachings found in spiritual wisdom, particularly in relation to ego and material attachments. Jesus, in his teachings, says that if anyone wants to take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. This sounds ridiculous. It sounds really counterintuitive. But as with all this old spiritual stuff, I learned to stop and ask myself, what would actually happen if this was true? I don't think that this is about generosity, rather it's about non-attachment, to not be hanging on to possessions as if my life depended on it, even when faced with loss. This breaks the fear and anxiety that comes from identifying too closely with material wealth. The real danger of financial loss isn't the loss of the money itself, but the threat it poses to our sense of self-worth when we tie our identity to our possessions or success. The Buddhist perspective on this is also interesting. Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence of things, and given that nothing is permanent, it also emphasizes not getting attached to things. The principle here is that losses don't matter if I'm not attached to money. What happens if it's true that everything, including wealth, status and success, is transient? Wealth comes and goes, and to cling to it as a source of happiness is merely to invite suffering and pain. I'm as guilty as clinging onto material things as much as anybody. I'm really not saying that this is easy. But what if all my fear of losing things actually comes from attachment? This isn't about denying the reality of financial hardship or pretending that loss isn't painful. Instead, it's a reminder that attachment to outcomes is often the root of our suffering. By letting go of the desire to control financial outcomes, I think we can find peace, even in the midst of loss. In this sense, non-attachment isn't about abandoning responsibility or ambition. It's about reframing our relationship to success and failure. Financial loss is probably inevitable, whether through market forces, bad luck, poor decisions. The question isn't whether we can avoid loss, but how we respond to it when it happens. As Rocky Balboa said, it ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. So where does this leave us? There's a lot of spiritual teachings out there. I've focused on Jesus and the Buddha because these are probably the two that I've studied most. There is a radical economics set out by Jesus and the Buddha, and I definitely want to explore this more. But as far as I can see, the truth is that all of the religions, all of the great spiritual teachings, more or less contain this wisdom. And it's really interesting to think about what happens to economics if it's actually true. These spiritual teachings converge on a common theme, the liberation that comes from detaching our sense of self-worth from material possessions and outcomes. In today's economy, this might seem like a woo-woo, unrealistic ideal. Personal identity and value is so often built on personal wealth. It's so fundamental to our current economic system, and so it seems to be the economic reality. But I have a feeling that this isn't true. So I propose that we need a new narrative around financial loss, not one of defeat, but one of opportunity. An opportunity to reassess our values, to practice humility, to cultivate a deeper sense of purpose that transcends the fluctuations of the market. So I've identified 3 principles here. First, to offset monetary loss with an appreciation of the wider benefits. Second, to see loss as a learning experience and continue going forward. And third, to understand the deeper truth that I am happiest if I'm not attached to money and material possessions, and that I don't need to fear loss. This is the basis of a more radical economics, and I am definitely signing up to it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.